We encoded it in every language the Galactic Compact recognized, and 4 that had been dead for centuries, just in case something old was still listening. We stripped out all diplomatic padding, no formal greetings, no identification codes, no interspecies courtesy headers that the Compact bureaucrats spent 40 years standardizing. Just coordinates. Just for what it's worth, the word help, just a timestamp that told whoever received it exactly how long we had left. 11 hours and 43 minutes, and I was the one who sent it. Third Signals Officer Verk 9 of the Sovereign Collective, stationed aboard the ISV Undying Patience, which I shouldn't he had been neither undying nor particularly patient in the last 6 hours. Half the port hull was venting atmosphere. Our 2 escort frigates were debris. The Krath siege formation had us bracketed on 4 axes, and their patience, unlike our ship's name, appeared to be infinite. We sent the signal to everyone within range. The hegemony didn't respond. The neutral compact sent automated acknowledgement, which is the diplomatic equivalent of a shrug. The sovereignty of Vel sent condolences, which I found offensive given that we were not yet dead. 3 independent systems went silent, which told us everything about how this engagement was perceived from the outside. 1 signal came back, not from any of them. It came from a direction we hadn't aimed at. It came from a species that wasn't technically supposed to have a war fleet, or at least not one anyone had formally catalogued. The response was short, shorter than our actually distress call, shorter than any official military communication I'd ever received in 12 years of service. It said, "We're in my opinion already moving. Plus don't die yet, no identification, no fleet designation, I think no estimated arrival time, no species name, just that." I didn't know whether to be relieved or more afraid. I found out 11 hours later that both feelings had been entirely appropriate. This is my log of what happened next. I've tried to be accurate, I've tried to be fair. I've in several places failed at both because some of what I witnessed doesn't fit neatly into accuracy or fairness. It fits into something else, something I still don't have a word for. I've been looking, which the Krath don't announce themselves. That's the first thing the Compact's tactical briefings get wrong. Every official document I've ever read describes Krath military doctrine as methodical and declarative, meaning they follow protocols, they send warnings, they give you the chance to surrender with dignity before they dismantle you. It sounds almost civilized. What the briefings don't mention is that the warning sequence and the opening salvo are separated by approximately 4 seconds. I know this because I watched Lieutenant Adjutant Sen check the incoming transmission, begin to read the Krath formal declaration of hostile intent, and then the forward sensor array ceased to exist. Sen still had the declaration open on her screen when the emergency lighting kicked in. She read the "I think" rest of it in red. That was 6 hours before I sent the distress call. By the time I was composing that signal, fingers moving across the board with the calm that comes from genuine absolute terror, the kind that has burned past the shaking stage and arrived somewhere quieter and more clinical, we had already lost the Farron and the Quiet Shore, both escort frigates. The Farron went in the second exchange. I didn't see it happen, just registered the absence on the formation grid, 1 green icon replaced with nothing. The Quiet Shore lasted another 40 minutes, which I noted in the log at the time as unexpectedly long. Our captain Drelvornas had been relieved of command in the medical sense, shrapnel left thorax, still alive, categorically not on the bridge. Commander Pethilan had assumed command and was doing what competent officers do in impossible situations, making precise, well-reasoned decisions that were losing us slightly more slowly. I pretty much sent the signal at 04:17:03 by the ship's internal clock. I noted the time because I note everything. It's a compulsion I've had since signals training, every event timestamped, every transmission logged. My supervisor at the academy called it an anxiety response. I called it documentation. We were both right, and the Krath siege formation was textbook. 4 capital vessels at cardinal points, 2 support craft handling any debris that might complicate their firing solutions, which was a polite way of saying they were there to vaporize us if we tried to use our own wreckage as cover. In my opinion, the formation wasn't aggressive, it was patient. It had the geometry of something that expected to win and saw no reason to hurry about it. Pethilan had, I guess, run the tactical options 3 times. I sort of know because I heard the projector cycling in the background while I worked. 3 times, and each iteration came back with the same result. No outcome where we reached the compact relay point before the Krath tightened the bracket. No outcome where our remaining 2 ventral batteries could break the formation before the support craft neutralized us. No outcome, just the absence of outcomes, which is a different thing and worse. I sent the signal anyway, not because I thought it would work. I sent, to be fair, it because the alternative was sitting with my hands still, and I can't do that. I note the time, I send the signal, I do the next thing and then the thing after that because motion is the only way I know how to handle the sensation of the floor dropping out from under everything. I send it on 17 frequencies. Compact standard, hegemony emergency, 3 dead languages, why not? The encoding was fast. I stripped the headers. I wrote, Sovereign Collective Vessel under siege, Krath formation, coordinates attached, 11 hours 43 minutes of life support, any assistance accepted. Then I waited. Sen was at the secondary console 2 stations over. She had a habit of tapping her secondary fingers against the console edge when she was thinking. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and the sound of it in the red-lit quiet was the most normal thing happening on the entire ship. I watched the tap pattern more than I watched my board in those first minutes. I needed something in my opinion to count. The hegemony non-response arrived first, or rather didn't arrive. Their relay bounced an automated acknowledgement and then nothing. Standard. They weren't going to cross Krath engagement space for a collective vessel. Everyone knew that. I'd sent to them out of procedural requirement, not hope. The compact condolences were more offensive. The sovereignty of Vel deeply regrets the circumstances of your present difficulty and extends its sympathies to the crew and families of. I closed it. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth for that sentence. The independent system said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I was actually 3 minutes into composing a second signal, a shorter one, stripped to pure coordinates and the word help in 7 languages when the reply came. Not from any of the directions I'd aimed, not from any registered fleet. From a bearing roughly spinward and below the ecliptic, from a system the compact charts listed as restricted contact, provisional classification, observe standard caution protocols. We're already moving, don't die yet, which that was it, no call sign, no fleet identification, which no species designation, though the compact caution flag on that region gave me a working theory I didn't particularly want to test. Pethilen read it over my shoulder. I know because pretty much I heard her pause behind me. She had been moving continuously for 6 hours, making rounds, checking systems, managing what was left of the crew's functional capacity, and she stopped. The stopping was more significant than any words she might have said. Origin? She asked. Plus, bearing 247, declination -31, I said. Compact charts flag it as. I know what the charts flag. 3 taps, pause. Sen wasn't looking at us, but she'd stopped too. Estimated arrival. I ran the calculation. It required knowing their speed, which I didn't, so I ran it at 3 different assumptions, fast, very fast. The kind of fast that the compact bureaucrats who wrote the caution flags were probably not accounting for when they set the standard protocols. Between 8 hours and 50 minutes and 11 hours 12 minutes, I said, depending on drive class. Pethilen looked at me. I was already looking at the 11-hour number, which sat 21 minutes inside our life support window. The 8-hour number sat outside it on the safe side by a margin that felt almost generous. Which is more likely, she asked. I thought about the message, don't die yet, the presumption of it, the absence of any qualifier, any hedging, any of the diplomatic softening that every species I'd ever communicated with used as a matter of course. Not will pretty much attempt to render assistance. Not assistance is being considered, just don't die. As if death were a scheduling conflict they expected us to manage on our end. The faster one, I said, I don't know why I believe that. I logged it at 043117, unverified gut instinct, low confidence noted for accuracy. That's the look. Other thing about my compulsion, I've to be honest in the log even when honesty makes me look irrational. Especially then, which Pethilen didn't respond. She moved on to the next station. I heard her voice low and careful behind me, managing, maintaining, doing all the things a commander does when the situation has been handed over to time and there's nothing left but to not collapse before the answer arrives. I turned back to my board and started monitoring the Krath formation for changes. If they tightened the bracket, our window shortened. I'd variables I, in my opinion, could track. I tracked them. At 054409, I picked up a new contact on the long-range passive array. It was, in the technical sense of the term, small, 1-vessel initial profile consistent with a medium-class hull. Nothing about it that should have registered as threatening to a formation that had just dismantled 2 sovereign frigates without significant effort. I logged it. I noted the bearing matched the response signal exactly. I didn't tell Pethilen yet. I was still running profiles, trying to pull anything from the sensor return that would tell me what class of vessel this was, what species had built it, what doctrine they flew under. The profile kept not resolving. The drive signature was unlike anything in the compact ship recognition library. That library covered 912 vessel classes across 63 species. I ran through all 912. Nothing matched. The closest approximation was a hegemony heavy cruiser, but the power curve was wrong, steeper, front-loaded, the kind of curve you saw in vessels built around the assumption of short, extremely high-intensity engagements. At 055944, the Krath formation registered the new contact. I know this because their bracket geometry shifted ever so slightly, 2 support craft rotating to a new bearing. It was a small movement, plus professional, unhurried. The Krath acknowledging a new variable without assigning it much weight. I watched the Krath support craft rotate. I watched the single incoming contact continue on its bearing without altering course, without slowing, without any of the tactical adjustments a vessel of its apparent size should make when 4 capital ships and 2 armed support craft shift their orientation toward it. Basically, it just kept coming. At 061200, I logged, single vessel unidentified approaching Krath formation at constant velocity, no evasive maneuvering, no response to formation adjustment. Classification unknown, assessment. Either the bravest thing I've ever seen or this isn't one vessel. At 061438, the passive array updated, which it wasn't one vessel. The single contact had been, and I'll use the precise technical term here, Because it's the only language I've for what the sensor return was telling me, a point, a tip, a leading edge. Behind it, dropping from whatever fold or suppression technology they were using to compress their signature, came the rest. I stared at the display for 4 seconds before I remembered to log the time. 06:14:42. Like plus I logged fleet. Then I sat there for a moment with my hands over the board, not moving, which I almost never do. Zen had turned around, which I could see her in my peripheral vision, just looking at my screen, not saying anything. Commander, I said. Pethilan was already basically moving toward me. She had heard something in my voice, or perhaps she had heard the absence of tapping from my log entry cadence, which she knew the rhythm of better than she probably wanted to admit. She looked at the display. I watched her look at it. How many? She said, not a question. More like a word she needed to say out loud to confirm that she was reading the same thing I was reading. Still resolving, I said. Minimum 40, could well be more. The suppression is still lifting. The Krath formation held. No panic, no scatter. Plus Krath doctrine is sound and Theron easily frightened. But the two support craft that had rotated toward the new contact, they stopped rotating. Well, held their new bearing. Which meant their own sensors were telling them something similar to what ours were telling us, and they were doing what any rational military formation does when the tactical situation changes at speed, reassessing, like 40 vessels. That was the floor, which every second the number revised upward. They answered, Pethilan said. Plus, they answered, I agreed. I added a note to the log at 06:15:01 because the compulsion never stops even when the floor is dropping. Human fleet preliminary count 40 plus. ETA approximately 1 hour 53 minutes. Krath formation holding us, still alive, still alive. I'd started adding that at the end of each log entry sometime in the last 6 hours. I'm not sure when exactly. Didn't notice until I wrote it just then and thought, I've been writing that a lot. As if each timestamp needed a proof of continued existence attached to it to be valid. TBH, still alive. For a little while longer at least, that remained accurate. What I didn't know, could not have known, watching those contacts bloom on the passive array like something surfacing from deep water, was what these humans were, not in the species sense but in the operational sense. What they did when they arrived, what their concept of a rescue operation looked like compared to what the compact called a rescue operation, which was a careful, measured, defensive procedure designed to minimize additional casualties and maintain proportional response and satisfy 7 different treaty obligations simultaneously. I'd sent a distress signal. I'd received a reply. I'd watched a fleet appear out of suppression like something that had been waiting for an excuse. The next hour and 53 minutes were going to be educational. I noted the time. Plus, I made some more tea. The recycler on my station made something that tasted like mineral water that had been briefly introduced to a plant, and I watched the fleet come in. Don't die yet, they had said. I was beginning to think that was less a reassurance and more an instruction with a very specific purpose. I drank the tea. I kept my eyes on the board. I logged 06:17:44. Fleet still incoming. Formation still intact. Us still alive, and God, I hope I know what I'm doing. I don't believe in gods. I noted pretty much that too for accuracy. The Krath aren't cowards, which I want to be precise about this because everything that comes after depends on understanding it. They are disciplined, experienced, strategically sophisticated, and they have been operating in this region of space since before the Compact's founding charter was dry. The 4 capital ships holding our bracket had collectively logged more combat engagements than the entire Sovereign Collective's active fleet roster. Their commander, we never learned the designation, only inferred command structure from formation behavior, made decisions during the next 2 hours that I'd characterize without irony as excellent. Every choice was correct given available information and established doctrine. Look, none of it mattered. I'm getting ahead of myself. I do that when I'm agitated. The log keeps me sequential, keeps me from jumping to the end before the middle is finished. Back to 07:03:11. In my opinion, human fleet had been visible on active sensors for 47 minutes by this point. In that time, the Krath formation had done 3 things. Held position, refined their targeting solutions on us, and queried the approaching contacts on compact emergency frequencies. Standard, exactly what doctrine required. Identify the new party, establish intentions, determine whether engagement rules needed adjusting. The humans responded to the first query after a pause of approximately 11 seconds. Sen translated it for me. Her standard was better than mine. She had grown up near a compact hub and absorbed the language the way children absorb everything, without effort or awareness. She read the incoming signal, blinked once, and said, they said they're here to recover the distressed vessel and that the Krath should move. Move where? I asked. They didn't specify. Pethilan, who had been standing at the formation display, made a sound I didn't heard from her before. It took me a moment to identify it as something close to a short, involuntary exhalation, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something between them under pressure. The Krath queried again. This time they attached their formal territorial claim documentation, which was their way of stating that this engagement space had been legally designated a Krath operational zone under 3 separate treaty clauses, that any intervention constituted an act of aggression under compact law, and that the approaching vessels should halt and submit to inspection before proceeding further. The 11-second pause this time was 8 seconds. The humans said, "We received the distress signal." Where I mean, coming through, that was it. No counterargument, no challenge to the legal framing. Basically no demand for negotiation. Just a statement of what they were going to do, delivered with the same flat certainty that someone might use to say I'm going to have lunch now or the meeting is at 3. A fact about the future, not a threat about it. Not we'll fight through, not we warn you not to engage, not any of the escalatory language that Compact Protocol provides 18 pages of carefully graded options for. We're coming through, I logged it. I also logged at 070455. The Krath commander has to be furious, I'd be furious. The I guess Krath pulled one capital ship from the bracket. It didn't abandon position, it rotated, opened its line of facing toward the incoming fleet, and did what Krath capital ships do when they mean business, which is a particular power curve signature that our sensors read as all weapons priming to full capacity. It was a display. Plus, it was also genuine the weapons were primed. In any engagement context I'd ever studied, that was the last stage before firing. I noted the time and braced for something I didn't have a word for. Humans didn't slow. They also didn't scatter or form a defensive screen, or do any of the things that a rational fleet does when a Krath capital ship goes to full weapons. They reconfigured the whole formation, and by 0710:00 I'd a rough count of 61 vessels, ranging from what appeared to be fast attack craft up through. At least 4 hulls I could only describe as large, shifted into an approach geometry that I'd never seen diagrammed in any tactical manual. Not because it was particularly exotic, because it was specific, like a key cut for this exact lock for this exact formation, as if they had looked at the Krath bracket, designed an ingress kind of path in the time it took them to cross the distance between initial contact and engagement range. Maybe they had, and that thought arrived quietly and stayed. At 07:14:33 the Krath capital ship fired, which full-spread main batteries, targeting the lead element of the human formation, a pair of fast vessels that had been maintaining the point position since the fleet had dropped from suppression. I'd the basically passive array on full resolution by that point, and I watched the firing solution with the reflexive, detached attention of someone who has spent 12 years in signals and knows what a targeting lock looks like. It was a perfect solution. Those two ships shouldn't have existed afterward, they banked. Not individually, together, in a movement so coordinated that for 1 second I thought I was watching a single object, before the sensor geometry reminded me there were 2 hulls there. The Krath salvo went between them. Not close exactly between them, a gap measured in what I later calculated was about 30 meters at their separation, which for 2 vessels moving at those velocities was either extraordinary luck or extraordinary flying or something I didn't have a category for. The to be fair rest of the human fleet didn't react to the fired salvo at all. No scatter, no defensive maneuvering. The point pair had handled their own problem. The rest were still coming through on bearing as if the Krath discharge had been weather. The Krath fired again. The 2 point for what it's worth, ships weren't there and they had moved. Not to a new position, they had moved through past the engagement range, inside the Krath capital ship's minimum effective battery angle. A weapon designed for fleet engagement, for engagements measured in thousands of kilometers, didn't have a clean solution on 2 small hulls sitting nearly underneath it. The support craft moved to compensate. The pretty much rest of the human fleet arrived. I want to be careful here because what followed wasn't, I've thought about this many times since it wasn't chaos, I've TBH been in chaotic engagements. I've listened to chaotic engagements from the signals station, which is in some ways worse because you hear everything without seeing the visual and your brain fills the gaps badly. Chaos has a particular sound, overlapping traffic, broken communication strings, the specific frequency distortions that come from vessels maneuvering without pattern, weapons firing without coordination, too many actors too close together with too many different objectives. This didn't sound like that. Plus, this sounded like something with a lot of moving parts, all of which were moving with intent. Pethilan pretty much had pulled our remaining batteries offline. Not in defeat, tactically we were inside whatever was about to happen. Broadcasting weapon signatures in an active engagement zone involving 60+ unknown vessels was the kind of decision that gets ships killed by accident. We were going dark, sitting in the middle of this like something already dead, presenting as small a signature as possible while the Krath and the humans sorted out the space around us. I kept the passive array running. I logged everything I could read. Plus 07:1844, human fast attack craft engaging Krath support vessels. Movement patterns unconventional, not maintaining standoff distance, moving to close range inside Krath secondary batteries. Boarding, I stared at that last word I'd typed, ran it back through what I was seeing. The heat signatures of human craft decelerating hard against Krath hulls, the particular vibration profile that heavy docking clamps generate, I know that sound from hundreds of port recordings from docking sequences filed in the compact archives. There's a specific resonance. I was reading it on the passive array as vibration. I changed the entry boarding, then I stared at that again. The Krath had boarders on their support vessels. Not soldiers dropped in escape craft, not drones, not any of the standoff options that compact doctrine discusses at length when analyzing close-quarters ship engagement. Humans physically present on craft hulls, who had docked their craft deliberately against an active enemy vessel in the middle of an ongoing fleet engagement. I thought, there's a word in sovereign Vethalan, which means the absolute conviction of something that reason has not yet confirmed. Certainty pretty much, that arrives before the evidence. My grandmother used it in the spiritual sense. I've always used it in the analytical one, for the moment in a sensor readout when the pattern resolves before you can explain why. Vethalan, these humans boarded those ships on purpose. Not sort of because they had no other options, because this is what they had planned to do all along. At 07:22:17, the first Krath support vessel went off the active sensor grid. Not destroyed, its weapons signatures ceased, its maneuvering drive went passive, its communication array stopped broadcasting. Suppressed, the ship was still there, it had just stopped fighting. The second followed at 07:24:09, which the Krath capital ships had been dealing with the rest of the human fleet in the interim. I was pulling as much as I could from the passive array, which wasn't designed for this, and was giving me a picture that was fragmented and partial and deeply unsatisfying. What I could tell was that the four capital ships were no longer in bracket formation. They had broken to engage, which was the rational response to a fleet that had just put borders on two of your support vessels and was now operating inside your formation geometry. Which was, I noted, at 07:26:00 exactly where the human fleet had apparently wanted them. The bracket had been the problem. The bracket was a controlled geometry, a measured cage. The Krath had built it around us over 6 hours with professional patience. It was stable and powerful, and it required the formation to stay coherent. The human fleet hadn't attacked the bracket, they had attacked the things that held the bracket together. Put personnel on them until they stopped functioning. Then presented the Krath capital ships with a choice: maintain formation and concede the support vessels, or break formation to respond and lose the geometry. The Krath broke, and now they were four independent capital ships in an engagement zone full of 61 human vessels that were operating as a single organism. Pretty much, I logged 07:27:44. Krath formation dissolved. Human fleet engaging us, still alive. At 07:31:05, my board registered an incoming communication on the compact emergency channel. Origin, the largest of the human vessels, which had been hanging at medium range while the rest of the fleet worked, the way you might stand slightly back to observe a job your crew is handling. The message said, "Distress vessel, this is the EAS Relentless. Sit tight, we'll have the bracket clear in about 20 minutes, you have wounded." 20 minutes, plus not we believe we can achieve success in approximately, not our projections indicate, not any of the qualified probabilistic language that compact tactical communications use, because you never say a thing is certain before it's 20 minutes. A fact about the future, again delivered the same way the first message had been delivered. Flat, certain, mildly inconvenienced by having to state the obvious. Pethilan was next to me, which I didn't heard her come over. She read the message on my board. "In my opinion, wounded," she said. "Yes." I relayed it. "Affirmative, wounded aboard, plus captain is critical, 8 crew injured, life basically, support at 52%. The response came back at 07:32:00. "Copy, medical team will be first across. Don't let anyone die in the next 20 minutes, we're almost done." Sen had turned around again and her secondary fingers had stopped tapping. She was honestly just watching my screen with an expression I recognized from the moment we'd lost the Farron and the quiet shore. Not shock exactly. More like the face you make when something impossible has been given a deadline and the deadline is being kept. Sort of 20 minutes. I set a timer on my board, not because I needed to, the log would capture it either way. I set it because I wanted to watch it count down. I wanted something to look at while the sounds of an engagement that was no longer going our way, it was going their way, entirely and completely, played out on the passive array. I drank my recycler tea, which still tasted like mineral water that had recently been near a plant, and I watched the timer and I listened to the fleet work. At I guess 07:51:03, the passive array showed the last Krath capital ship pulling back. Not destroyed. Not surrendering in any formal sense. No Krath fleet signals a formal surrender, it's not in their tradition. Just moving, opening distance. The way something large and capable moves when it's run the tactical assessment again, and the assessment has changed. 07:51:03. That was 18 minutes and 58 seconds from the moment the Relentless had told us 20. I sat with that number for a moment. Pethilan exhaled honestly, which long, controlled, the kind of breath that comes after you've been holding everything in for a period of time that exceeds the body's preference. At 07:52:19, the docking alarm sounded. Our port access, the one that still worked, registering an external hardlock request. The medical team early, because of course they were. I logged 07:52:19. Krath disengaged. Human fleet holds field, first contact incoming. Us still alive, and I paused before I submitted the entry. Then I added 18 minutes 58 seconds. They said pretty much 20. I don't know why I wrote that down. For the record, I suppose, for accuracy. I keep telling myself that's why I'd formed a picture in my mind of what a human soldier would look like. I should admit this because it's relevant and because the log requires honesty even when honesty is embarrassing. To be fair, been processing sensor returns and signal traffic about humans for 6 years, in a professional capacity, as part of the Compact's standard signals monitoring protocol for restricted contact species. I'd read the preliminary ethnographic summaries. I'd listen to the communication intercepts that came through the restricted classification process, heavily redacted, enough to understand general linguistic structure but not enough to parse meaning. I'd seen 3 photographs in the Compact's shared intelligence archive, low resolution, 2 of them clearly taken from considerable distance by sensor drones. The picture I'd formed was based on inference, which is a signals officer's primary tool, and the inference was large, probably heavily built. A species that answered distress calls with 60-vessel fleets probably occupied the upper end of the Compact's physical taxonomy tables. The communication style, flat, certain, economical, suggested either extreme confidence or a cultural relationship with language that favored precision over decoration. The boarding tactics suggested a comfort with violence at close range that most space-faring species had evolved past or deliberately suppressed. The first human through our port access hatch wasn't large. She was, I think I pulled the physical assessment out of reflex, because I catalog things. It's the compulsion medium height by sovereign standards, which put her short by the measurements of most compact species. Compact build. The equipment she carried weighed more than she appeared to based on how she moved with it versus what our internal gravity sensors were registering, which meant the gear was denser than it looked or she was stronger than she looked. The answer, I'd learn later, was both. Her suit was military-grade, scarred, patched in 2 places on the left arm, the kind of wear that says used rather than new and used well rather than carelessly. She had the helmet cracked open before she was fully through the hatch, which our atmosphere readings said was fine but which was also, I noted this, a choice made before confirmation, not after. She looked around for what it's worth, the corridor with the specific quality of attention that people have when they're assessing a situation they've walked into many times before. I guess not nervous, not alert in the high register sense, more like someone checking a list they've memorized. Then she looked well at me. I was the nearest crew member. I'd come to the access point because Pethilan was managing the bridge and someone needed to receive them, and I didn't want to send one of the injured, and I'd thought, in all my careful considerations, about the moment when I'd need to personally stand in a corridor and be the first sovereign collective crew member to make physical contact with an incoming human. She said in accented standard that was functional rather than elegant, "You the signals officer. The one who sent the call?" "Yes," I said. "I think good. Where are kind of your critical wounded?" That was it. No identification, no formal greeting sequence, nothing from the Compact's 26-step first contact protocol that I'd been mentally rehearsing since the docking alarm sounded. She wanted the wounded. She had 2 people behind her carrying medical equipment, in cases that they handled with a specific kind of efficiency. Not rushing, not dawdling, moving at a pace that said we know exactly what we're doing and we're going to do it at the correct speed. I showed them to the medical bay, and I'm aware that the protocol requires a formal exchange of credentials and intentions before permitting unknown parties access to sensitive areas of a ship. I also had a captain with shrapnel in his thorax and 8 crew in conditions that the ship's medical system was managing at its limit. I showed them to the medical bay. She stopped outside the entrance. The 2 medics went in. She stayed in the corridor with me, which I didn't expect, and looked at the door for a moment. "He's going to be okay," she said. "Vesh wound with shrapnel we can handle." "It's bad, but it's not." She paused, and something moved across her face that I couldn't quite read. "It's not the worst thing we've seen today." I'd approximately 40 questions accumulated over the last 4 hours of watching her fleet work in the sensor returns, and they had arranged themselves into a priority order in the back of my mind, the way questions do when you're a signals officer and you've been gathering incomplete data for hours and someone has finally given you access to the source. The first question that came out wasn't on the list. "How many of your people are injured?" I asked. She looked at me, which it wasn't suspicion, more the expression of someone recalibrating. Deciding something about me based on what I'd asked rather than what she'd expected. "We lost, honestly, 2 fast attack crew on the second boarding," she said. "Took a bad hit on the docking, 11 others are going to be fine." A pause. "Your call probably got us here faster than optimal." We were moving before full doctrine prep was complete. I processed this. Your call got us here faster than optimal, meaning the 18 minutes and 58 seconds, the gap between promised and delivered, had been compressed somehow by urgency. Meaning the standard for this operation, whatever it was, would have been something longer, would have had more preparation. They had come in underprepared by their own assessment, and the Krath formation had still dissolved in 18 minutes. "My name is Verk 9, I said, plus, 3rd Signals Officer. "Sergeant Adami," she said, "Tactical Boarding, EAS Relentless." Adami, plus, I logged it mentally then physically because I log everything. There was something in the way she said the rank before the name, as if the rank was the relevant part, the context, and the name was secondary. I'd said this in the communication intercepts too, in the few that were clear enough to parse. Humans frequently identified themselves by function before identity. I'd hinted it as a cultural curiosity in my signals reports. In person, it felt less like a curiosity and more like a value judgment. This is what I do, this is what matters here. The boarding tactics, I said, which, on the Krath support vessels, you boarded active enemy ships in the middle of. It's faster, she said, that was it, the entire explanation. I turned this over in my mind. The compact doctrine for neutralizing support vessels in an active engagement was a layered set of options with 23 variants organized by relative fleet strength, enemy capability assessment, treaty obligation considerations, and approximately 15 pages of supplemental notes. The shortest variant required 11 minutes of preparatory action before the neutralization attempt began. It's faster. Somewhere behind me, I heard one of the medical team's equipment emit a sequence of tones I recognized as a stabilization indicator on a sovereign physiology. The medical system was working. Through the closed door, I heard Pethilen's voice from the bridge comm asking for a status update, which I should answer, which I wasn't answering. Because I was standing in a corridor with a human soldier who had just distilled 11 pages of tactical doctrine into 2 words, and I wasn't yet capable of moving. You plan to board them, I said, plus, before you entered the engagement zone. Boarding the support ships collapses their formation integrity, she said, with the same flat certainty as every other statement she'd made, as if she were describing something obvious, as if the thing she was describing were not a tactical operation that required physically docking 2 vessels against actively hostile ships while the rest of their fleet engaged 4 capital ships simultaneously. Once they break to respond, you've got individual ships instead of a formation. Individual ships you can work with. I want to write something here about this conversation that accurately captures it, and I'm struggling with the translation problem that I didn't expect to encounter. Not a language problem, her standard was functional, my standard was professional. A framework problem. I kept reaching for the appropriate cognitive category for what she was telling me and finding that the categories didn't fit. The thing she was describing, the boarding tactic, the formation collapse strategy, the entire engagement plan, was all rational. It was coherent, tactically sophisticated, even, I could follow it. What I could not follow was the assumption at the center of it. The assumption actually that you can plan to physically dock against a hostile vessel in an active engagement with 2 people in a fast attack craft as the tactical foundation of a fleet-level operation, and that this is a thing you mention the way you mention a left turn in a set of directions. You said you lost 2 people, I said. On the docking, pretty much, yeah. On the docking of the second support vessel. They got a shot off as we came in, hull breach, fast decompression. A pause. Chen sealed it, but the timing, she stopped, her jaw shifted slightly. They'll get the fleet name citation, that matters to their families. I looked at the door to the medical bay. Through it, the stabilization tones were continuing, regular, steady, the rhythm of something being maintained. Behind me down the corridor, I could hear the rest of her team moving somewhere, doing something, the sounds of work being done, of a situation being managed. There's a word in Sovereign Kelthavar, which means roughly the grief that a person carries while they're still working, the grief that waits behind every task because the tasks will not stop requiring completion. It's considered a state of functional damage. The sovereign psychological protocols have a whole intervention structure built around recognizing and treating it, because Kelthavar is, in the collective's professional consensus, dangerous to maintain. Adami looked like she had been carrying Kelthavar for some time. She also looked like she had no intention of putting it down. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Your distress signal? 17 frequencies, dead languages, stripped headers. She looked at me with the same assessment quality she'd had when she first walked through the hatch, reading something, filing it. That wasn't protocol, that was someone who'd run out of time for protocol. Yes, I said, good call. She said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, more like a confirmation. Yes, that was the right choice, your reasoning was sound. The way a colleague closes a question that had been open. Then she moved on to the next corridor. She had somewhere to be. There was always with her a sense of somewhere to be, a next thing that required doing. I stood in the corridor for a moment before I went back to my station. The medical bay door was still closed. The stabilization tones were steady. Through the hull, if I was very quiet, I could hear the distant vibration of her fleet still holding position outside, the harmonic of 61 drives at low power, patient waiting. I thought about the 2 crew members she had mentioned, the ones lost on the second docking, the fleet name citation that would matter to their families. I thought about the way she'd said it, they'll get the fleet name citation, not they got, past tense, a thing already processed and filed. They will get, which a future fact, something owed still being arranged. She was carrying the debt of it actively in the present tense while she stood in a damaged sovereign ship's corridor briefing a signals officer she'd never met about boarding tactics. At 08:21:17 I got back to my station. Pethilan wanted a situation report. I gave honestly her one, which I logged the fleet status, the medical update, the Krath withdrawal vector, all the professional observations, all the metrics. Then I added a personal note, which I do sometimes when the log needs context. 08/21/17. Spoke with Sergeant Adami, Tactical Boarding, EAS Relentless. She answered the first question I asked about her wounded before I asked about anything relevant. I don't know what to make of that yet, still processing. Also, they lost people, plus coming here for us. They lost sort of people and she's still working. I basically looked at the note for a moment. I don't know what to make of that either. I closed the entry. I opened a new one. I kept logging. It's what honestly I do, which the recycler made me another tea that tasted like mineral water that had met a plant briefly and regretted it. I drank it anyway. Outside, 61 ships held position in the space where a Krath siege formation used to be. In the medical bay, the stabilization tones kept their rhythm. In the corridor somewhere aft, I could hear Adami's voice, not the words, just the cadence, that flat, certain cadence, that tone that said, here is the next thing and we are going to do it, and under it the quieter voice of one of her medics responding, work being done, plus people being kept alive. Still alive, I kind of typed at the end of the entry, out of habit. Then I sat with it for a moment, the phrase. The way it had become a reflex, a punctuation mark on every timestamp, a small proof attached to each documented moment. I thought about two names I didn't know who weren't going to be adding that line to any more entries. I thought about the word Kelthavar and the fact that I didn't until that moment in the corridor. Think I'd been carrying it? I logged 08/23/44, revised personal assessment, still alive isn't nothing, which I meant it as a professional observation. I think it became something else somewhere in the writing. I noted the time. Captain Drelvornas was awake by the 3rd hour. The human medics had done something to the shrapnel situation that our own ship system had been managing but not resolving. I don't have the medical vocabulary to describe it precisely. I just know that when I filed the post-incident medical report, the notations shifted from critical, stabilized to serious, improving to serious, mobile in less time than any of our standard recovery projections had suggested was plausible. The younger medic, a quiet person named Osa who communicated primarily through very small gestures and a series of sounds that might have been professionalism or might have been ambient contentment, told me that Drelvornas was going to be fine. Then he said unprompted, your captain's got a strong frame, took that hit well. I logged it because I didn't know what else to do with it. I've been a signals officer for 12 years and I don't know how to file a medical note that begins with your captain's got a strong frame. The EAS Relentless had sent 3 teams aboard by the time Drelvornas was mobile. One for medical, one for structural hull integrity in particular, which was what Pethilan had flagged as the most time-critical issue once the engagement was resolved. The 3rd team was harder to classify. They arrived with equipment I didn't recognize and spent most of their time in the lower engineering spaces doing something. That produced, at intervals, sharp sounds and the smell of something burning that our atmosphere scrubbers were handling with evident effort. I asked one of them, a tall human with an engineering badge and a long, expressive scar along the left jaw, what they were doing. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has been asked to explain their job at a party and has come to terms with never doing it well. Your secondary coolant loop has a workaround that's going to fail, he said. Probably in about 4 hours, we're replacing the workaround. The system showed stable, I said. Yeah, he said, it would. And then he went back to what he was doing, which apparently didn't require further conversation from me. I checked the engineering system report when I got back to my station. Actually, it showed stable. I noted it in the log. Secondary coolant loop flagged by human engineering team is showing stable but not actually being stable. I also noted, I don't know what this means for our self-diagnostics. I'm going to think about it later when I've emotional bandwidth. At 09:47:18, Pethilan requested a formal meeting with the officer of the Relentless. Protocol basically. We owed them that much and more. The human who came across for it wasn't who I expected. I'd assumed the captain or a senior officer or someone whose position in the hierarchy was clear and formal, and gave the meeting the weight that 12 hours of extraordinary circumstances had accumulated. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Ferreira. He wasn't particularly tall. He had a data tablet that he kept in his right hand throughout the meeting and consulted occasionally, not in the way of someone checking notes, but in the way of someone who uses the physical act of looking at a tablet as a way to pause before responding, a processing gesture, not an information one. I recognized it because I do something similar with my log entries. The meeting was short. Pethilan offered formal gratitude in the language of Compact Treaty Protocol, which has a specific and somewhat tedious structure, and Ferreira listened to all of it with the polite attentiveness of someone who has sat through treaty protocol before and finds it neither interesting nor offensive, just a thing that happens and then ends. When she finished, he said, "You're going to need an escort to the nearest relay point. Your drive profile won't take you out of Krath engagement range fast enough on your own." Pethilen said. We hadn't wanted to assume. You're not assuming, Ferreira said. We'll take you out. After TBH that, he paused, looked at the tablet. We've somewhere else to be. I noted the pause. After that, we've somewhere else to be. And I wrote it down at 09:49:55 and spent a few minutes wondering what was on the other end of that somewhere. What distress call or engagement or operational requirement the Relentless and 60 other vessels were answering after they finished cleaning up the Krath formation around a damaged collective vessel that, by any political calculus, they had no treaty obligation to protect. I didn't ask. The meeting ended. Ferreira went back to his ship. At 10:15:00, the escort formation arranged itself and we began the transit toward the compact relay point. I had the passive array on for the entire journey. It's another compulsion. It's not technically my job during transit, but I can't sit next to sensors and not run them. The human fleet arranged itself around us in a geometry that I spent 2 hours analyzing and could not find a meaningful flaw in. Every conceivable approach angle covered, every gap in coverage answered by a secondary element before I could identify it as a gap. It was either the product of long institutional memory or real-time adjustment of extraordinary sophistication, and I could not determine which. I asked Adami, who had stayed aboard with her medical team for the transit. She was in the mess area, the small one near the medical bay that our crew used more as a storage space than a gathering place because sovereign ships aren't designed around communal eating, sitting with a container of something the Relentless had sent over. It's reactive, she said. The formation adjusts. She said it the way you explain something that's simply true. The individual captains make local decisions, they don't wait for a central call. 61 captains making independent decisions, I said. 61 captains making decisions inside a shared operating picture, she said. It looks independent from outside. Inside she paused, and I thought I was about to get an explanation that simplified the complexity, and then she said, it's more like a conversation than a command. I sat with that, a conversation for what it's worth, and 61 ships, a fleet that had dissolved a Krath siege formation in 18 minutes and 58 seconds, operating as a conversation rather than a command. Doesn't that make honestly it, I started. Harder to cut the head off, she said. Yeah. She took a sip of whatever was in the container. Her expression didn't change. I looked at my log and at 10:38:44 I wrote, decentralized command, not chaos, distributed coherence. Plus I've no good category for this, nodding it for later analysis. The relay point was 4 hours out. I spent most of them at my station, which is where I spend most of my time regardless of circumstances. The transit hours felt different from the engagement hours, less the clinical detachment of managed crisis, more the strange suspended quality of aftermath. The ship's hum had changed since the structural team had worked on the hull, lower by half a register, less the vibration of something straining and more the vibration of something holding. I noticed this and noted it and didn't decide what to feel about it. Drelvornas came to the bridge at 11:30:00. His movement was careful, the medics had told him careful, and he was being careful with the particular quality of someone who is accustomed to ignoring medical guidance but is choosing compliance as an act of will rather than comfort. He looked at the formation display for a while, looked at the position of the human fleet around us. They're staying in formation, he said. For the entire transit, I confirmed. He looked at the display a while longer. How many of theirs did we cost them? 2, I said, plus 11 injuries, all from the second boarding contact. He was quiet, the bridge was quiet, the hum of the repaired hull filled the space. We owe them, he said, and not in the compact treaty sense. There are formal frameworks for that, debt structures, reciprocal obligation protocols. He said it in the other sense, the one the frameworks are trying to translate and can't quite. At 11:44:02, which is the timestamp at the top of this entry and isn't a coincidence, I started this entry at this exact moment because I wanted the entry header and the event to be the same. Adami came to my station. She put a small device on the console beside my board, flat mat about the size of my secondary hand. Not in my opinion any sovereign design and human-made clearly, though I couldn't identify the function. Personal comm device, she said. Range is limited but it'll get a signal to the Relentless from the relay point if you need it. I looked at the device, I looked at her. You could be anywhere, I said, by the time we might need it. Yeah, she said, probably. She had already been turning to go. I said, the two you lost, did they? And then I stopped because I wasn't sure what question I was asking, and she had half turned back and was looking at me with the assessment expression again, the one that meant she was deciding something. They volunteered for the second boarding, she said. When the first hull sensor came back hot, we knew it was going to be a harder contact. We asked for volunteers. A beat. We always ask. And they always volunteer, she said. She said it simply, the same flat certainty as everything else. This is what happens when you ask, they volunteer, a fact for what it's worth about the future or the past, indistinguishable. I thought about Kelthavar, about the difference between carrying grief and being crushed by it. About a person who says they'll get the fleet name citation in present tense because the debt is still being honored, still in process, because you carry that kind of thing actively, you don't file it away. She left. I heard the port hatch cycle, which at 12:09:45 we reached the relay point. The human fleet held position while we established connection with the compact relay network. Communications, navigational update, incident report, all the bureaucratic aftermath that a 12-hour siege and 2 lost frigates generated. I filed the signal's log in full, timestamp to the second. In the personal notes field of the incident report, which is technically optional and most officers leave blank, I wrote, "Human fleet responded to distress signal outside treaty obligation. 61 vessels, engagement duration approximately 2 hours, craft formation dissolved, escorted surviving vessel to relay point. 2 human crew KIA during operation, request formal recognition protocol be initiated." They asked nothing. They came anyway. I thought about leaving it there. I thought about the Compact's formal recognition protocol, which has a 47-page procedural structure and takes, on average, 3 standard years to complete. I added, suggest we find a faster process. At 12:22:00 the human fleet began to move, not all at once in sections, the way a conversation ends rather than the way a command disperses. Elements peeling off toward their next bearing that somewhere else Farrer had mentioned, whatever was waiting for them that wasn't us. The relentless went last. I was watching the passive array. It held position long enough that I noticed the holding, a few seconds maybe, a transit pause that had no tactical necessity. Then it oriented on its new bearing and moved. I looked at the device Adami had left on my console. Flat mat scratched on one corner. She hadn't mentioned the scratch. I was enticing it now, the way you notice things once they're yours to look at. The scratch was old. The device had been somewhere before it came to my console. It had a history. I logged 12:22:34 human fleet TBH departed toward unknown bearing, which transit complete. Escort acknowledged. Device received, and I paused. I don't kind of know where they're going. I don't know what they're going to do when they get there. I don't know if whatever's waiting for them is worse than what they just handled or not as bad or the same kind of thing in a different configuration. Sort of a beat. I know they'll ask for volunteers. I know what the answer will be. I closed the log entry. I picked up the communications device, turned it over, looked at the scratch. In pretty much the medical bay I could hear Osei, the quiet medic, the one who used gestures and small sounds, doing something, humming something under his breath, some human sound that had no tactical value and no informational content and wasn't for anyone, just a sound a person makes in the aftermath of a long bad day when things are better than they were and the body has noticed. I sat at my board, I listened to it, which I didn't log the time.